everyone. To begin with, I would like to thank the I.S.Rivers team for the invitation to share some elements on this major river basin that is located in the border of Mexico and Guatemala. Usumacinta is a river basin that crosses borders. It's part of one of the 24 cross-border river basins that we find between northern Panama and southern Mexico. And we've worked in 10 of these 24 river basins, as you can see on the map in different colors. And Usumacinta is the biggest in terms of surface area. It covers more than 77,000 square kilometers. And it's shared between southern Mexico, Guatemala, and a very tiny part of the river basin is located in Belize. This river basin has the most powerful river in the area. So we're in the deepest parts of Mexico and Guatemala, at the border between North America and Central America. So the Usumacinta River Basin comprises 17 sub-basins, as you can see in the different colors on the map. It can be described in three main sections. The first is where a river flows, Salinas La Pasión in Guatemala. The second section, 365 kilometers long, that creates the border between Mexico and Guatemala. So it's an international river, a river border. And finally, in the downstream part, 386 kilometers that flow in Mexico. So it's a universe, as you can see on the map, where we've looked at all of the superficial water resources between the border of Mexico and Guatemala. There's water everywhere in different forms. This doesn't mean, as you can appreciate on the photos, that everyone has access to drinking water. No one has drinking water, as a matter of fact. And in many cases, as you can see on the photo, where women washing laundry on the riverbanks, the people who live along this river don't have access to running water at all. So it's a world full of water, a lot of water, but also a huge diversity and lots of social inequality. So what I'm going to propose today is that we look at the Usumacinta, starting from a concept of waterscape. So we talk about the different waterscapes in Usumacinta, and I'll start by explaining the concept. It comes from political ecology. And Swingadan, one of the authors who proposed the concept in 1999, it's a concept that makes it possible to bring into connection nature and society through the viewpoint of power relations. So when we talk about waterscapes, we're looking at the expression of the interaction between humans and their environment that encompasses all of the social, economic, and political processes through which water in nature is conceived of and manipulated by societies. But it's not just a material dimension. Waterscapes refer to physical flows, patterns of access, technologies, institutions, practices, legislative reforms, governance frameworks, and discourses around water that are mediated by social and political processes in a specific context, in a given space and time. And this leads us to try to question who controls, who acts, and who has the power.
Donc, pour ce faire,
So in order to do this, I would like to propose for Usumacinta to look at the three dimensions: the border aspect, the relationship between water and the borders, as you can see on the photo, where you see the border between Mexico and Guatemala that is physically marked in the middle of a lagoon. Secondly, the topic of conservation. We're on the Mexican side in a protected area on this photo. And then thirdly, we're going to look at hydropower and dams in the river. So to begin with, the transboundary aspects. So on this photo, we're at the river border. Mexico is behind us, and in front of us, we see Guatemala.
L'Usumacinta est un bassin versant transfrontalier trinational, mais pour notre objet, ce qui est intéressant, c'est la relation entre le Mexique et le Guatemala.
Interesting is the relationship between Mexico and Guatemala, because Belize really represents a minimal part of the river basin. I talked about the importance of the river that creates the border between the two countries. Over 1/3 of its length. And another important element to understand the cross-border dynamics is the absence of cooperation between the two states on the question of water management. In parallel, there is no open conflict between the two countries on water. Another point that attracted our attention is that throughout this river border, there are absolutely no bridges, which is quite surprising because in general, when you have a river that creates a border, and in this case, a major river, the two countries usually build bridges as soon as possible. So this element also shows the lack of cooperation in the Usumacinta River Basin. It's also important to mention that along the Usumacinta, the name Usumacinta is a Mexican name. And in Usumacinta in Guatemala when we use the word, doesn't talk about the river basin. As Usumacinta, they use another name. They refer to other rivers and other that flow in the Guatemalan side. So that's an interesting aspect of the power plays, the asymmetry between Mexico and Guatemala, that are trying to get an idea of a river basin that corresponds to a name, the name of one of the states that forms the territory of this river basin. Another important element in the Usumacinta waterscape is that the border between the two states determines the Guatemalan waterscape that is characterized by a certain number of political elements, and in particular, the lack of a water law, and very poorly structured water policy, and no local practices around But there are local practices around water that are connected to certain beliefs, native Indian beliefs. On the Mexican side, the waterscape corresponds to a federal law, very structured policy that was inherited from a very centrally built water policy in the 19th century. But in parallel, we find local water management practices. In both cases, if we place ourselves at the cross-border scale, we can say that the URB is characterized by the fact that they're isolated from the centers of power in both countries. And we see cross-border relations that are developed at a local level, but also local conflicts around water amongst the populations. The Transboundary River Basin, the international aspect of the river, in Mexico, the river actually also forms the borders between the different states that are in Mexico. So between Chiapas and Tabasco midstream, and then second separation, Tabasco and Campeche. There's the San Pedro River that separates these two states, thus creating a differentiation on an economic level in particular with regard to access to services, to water, sanitation, health services, and also electricity, as you can see on the two photos. On the top, we're at Tabasco, there's power, and on the bottom, Campeche on the other side of the river, and they have to install solar powers because they don't have an electricity grid. I'd now like to talk about conservation in the Usumacinta River Basin. So in Mexico, we have this obelisk that marks the border, and then we see that the border is cleared out in the forest, the tropical forest. On the right side, we have a protected area in Guatemala. So you can see that on this map. Inside the polygons in white, we see all of the protected areas in the Usumacinta River Basin. In terms of conservation, the protected areas are really vital to understand the dynamics of the river basin. On one hand, we have 86 protected areas in Guatemala, 28 in Mexico, a total of 114 representing 34.5% of the river basin, a bit more for Guatemala, 38%, and roughly 30% in Mexico. Having said that, similarly to water relations, there is no transboundary cooperation to protect these areas. The only cooperation that exists is for fire control. The Usumacinta River Basin saw several waves of colonization in its history. We talk about frontier areas because we see the frontier of agriculture advancing into the tropical forests and their extraction societies. There was extraction of mahogany over the centuries in this river basin. Right now, we see transboundary traffic of fauna, timber, and cattle. And one of the elements that continues to impact deforestation is the raising of cattle. There's a huge amount of trafficking in livestock. So the Usumacinta waterscape makes it possible to show that there are some convergences, environmental policies that are based on the marking out of the protected areas, but there are also national differences. The conservation policies around protected areas mean that there are different types of categories of protected areas. There are 6 in Mexico and 17 in Guatemala, and they're not always as efficient depending on where you are located in the country and in the river basin. On the photo on the left, we're on a plot of land where Mexico has a environmental services in place, but we see that they're growing corn nevertheless. On the second photo, we're practically at the Guatemalan border, and we see that the Mexican population is extracting wood and from a protected area in Guatemala. On another part of the river basin, we see a tractor and a protected area. And in the Campeche area, we see in a protected area there's a part of a tree that remains from the mangrove. So one of the elements of cooperation in this waterscape, the Usumacinta waterscape, as you can observe on the map, is fire control. There are forest fires between January and May 2019 that are shown here, and this indicates that this is a shared reality for both countries in this waterscape. And the red area, which is exactly at the border between the two countries. The third point that I wanted to address is hydropower and dams, which is a very important element. On the photo on the left, you can see the ruins of the base of a dam that was to be built in Mexico, and on the right, the biggest dam in Guatemala in this part of the river basin. The Usumacinta is a river and a river basin that's got a very high flow rate. It has huge hydropower potential. And it's an important element to understand the relationships between water and power, between the two countries, between the states and the local populations. We can see this in the different areas of Usumacinta over time and at different scales. Hydropower in the Usumacinta River Basin is an element of the waterscape at the local scale, but it's also an element of the waterscape of both countries because it reflects local political conditions and the characteristics of the political regime. Let me give you an example. When Guatemala in the 1980s started to build the dam on the Tisoic River, the biggest dam in Guatemala, and the biggest in Usumacinta at all. They transferred population out, and they actually committed massacres. And we were in a moment of a military dictatorship at the time, and you can see the relationship between the installation of the dam and the political power in place, and also the national situation. So dams and hydropower are a source of conflict. We can talk about Mexico's project to build a dam in the 1980s, but that was not actually built because there was a refusal of Guatemala to have part of the dam on its in its territory. And there was also a lot of movement against the dam in Mexico, so it was never built. It was a very conflictual situation. So it really shows the transborder issues in this river basin between the countries. So they can be sources of conflict, but can also make it possible to build transborder cooperation between the opponents of the dam in all parts of the river basin, as we can see on this slide. So only 3 minutes left. So this slide shows the waterscape in relation to Mexican hydropower at the time scale between the 1950s until just a few years ago, around this major project that was designed, abandoned, came back, and that produced huge resistance. And in the case of Guatemala, we have the Chitzoy dam that was built and some other projects. There are 4 dams on the Usumacinta in Guatemala in the upstream section. And there are lots of other projects planned or underway. Some have been stopped, but now there's huge social mobilization linked to the protection of the waterscape. So here are some images of the dams and the social movement to prevent the building of the dam. So very quickly to conclude, I tried to show the diversity of the Usumacinta waterscapes depending on physical and geographical components, also socio-political issues, cultural frameworks, and this entanglement between scale, time, and space that allows me to show a certain number of contrasting realities. But at the basin scale, in its entirety, we also show that there are some converging outcomes. I just want to conclude with the idea that the management Usumacinta really historically depended on the existence of an international border at the scale of the river basin that made it possible to show one Mexican waterscape and one Guatemalan waterscape, but at the local level, we have a certain number of waterscapes that depend on the relation between water conservation and power production, linked with the borders that's given rise to different waterscapes in this major river basin. Thank you very much for your attention.